Good morning, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us here today. I'm going to set some housekeeping rules. As you know, this event has simultaneous translation. So at the bottom of your screen, there's a globe, and don't forget to click and confirm the language selection. Vou falar em português. A gente tem tradução simultânea para o evento, então tem um globo embaixo da sua tela. Clique no globo e selecione o idioma. For questions, feel free to send the questions through the Q&A function. I'll be monitoring the questions throughout the event. And the idea is for this to be an interactive webinar, so feel free to ask the questions in either Portuguese or English, and I'd be happy to relay them to our speakers. And please, if there's any technical issues, there's a CRA IT person on for assistance. Feel free to ask for help on the Q&A as well. So today with us, we have Erika de Siqueira Seddon and Valentín Estévez. Erika is a partner at Mattos, Filho, a law firm that I do a lot of work with. She has a very impressive background in labor and employment, 15 years of experience in providing support on labor and union-related matters, as well as employment aspects of cross-border corporate and finance transactions. She also works with executive compensation, prepares and adjusts compensation and benefit plans, and represents companies in judicial and administrative litigation with the Labor Prosecutor's Office and the Ministry of Labor and Social Security in Brazil. Valentín is a colleague of mine, a vice president in our labor and employment practice. He has a PhD from the University of Chicago and assists firms with litigation-driven and proactive compliance assessments with international, federal, and state equal pay regulations. His engagements include helping companies prepare for and respond to investigations from government agencies and offering expert testimony in litigation. He also assists clients in ensuring compliance with employment regulations related to using artificial intelligence tools in employment decisions. So with that, I'll pass it on to Erika to start her presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. So good morning to all. Firstly, I would like to thank Charles Rivers Associates for such a kind invitation. It will be great to be with you all today and share some of the discussions Valentín and I were having about the gender pay gap discussions in the US and Brazil. So as the Brazilian attendees probably are aware of, the Brazilian Federal Constitution and other sports laws protect against several forms of discrimination, such as those based on age, color, deficiency, or gender. And even though existent law already provided for penalties due to discrimination, in 2023, President Lula enacted the gender pay parity law, which increased the maximum fines for employers paying lower salaries to workers due to discriminatory practices. These fines can be as much as 10 times the value of the new salaries of discriminated employees and doubled for repeated offenses. The law also targeted the disparity between salaries of women and men, which is around 21%, and aims to grant further career opportunities for women. And as the presentations shows, although women have a higher frequency of school and college attendance by 9% compared to men, women occupy only 39% of managerial positions. And the positions and these managerial positions that we occupy are usually the start of the career. If we look at executive level positions, the numbers are much worse. For example, a survey with public health companies shows that women occupy only 15% of officers and board members positions. So it is a huge discrepancy. And Valentín, if you can go over to the next one. Thank you. And as in the rest of the world, Brazilian women occupy twice as much time as men on caregiving and household activities. So if I may suggest a reading, there is a book by Claudia Goldwyn regarding the title is Career and Family, and she won the Nobel Prize for this study. This is a Harvard professor, and her study shows how these society norms that women are those responsible for taking care of children, parents, and of a house, for example. This is something that is really impacting women's career. So it's not much as a matter of companies with discriminatory practices, but something that unfortunately we as a society still have. So as a result of the new law, companies with 100 or more employees are now required to publish the gender pay parity report, which is the one that Valentín is showing. This report is prepared by the Ministry of Labor and Employment and must be published on, in March and September of each year in the company's websites, social media, or similar channels. And this report may not be adjusted by the companies, even in case it shows relevant inconsistencies. And today is a great timing for our webinar because yesterday the Ministry of Labor published instructive normative that provides some guidance, some guidelines about future inspections, for example, as well as they validate the practice some companies had of publishing together with the report explanatory notes on the data presented by the Ministry of Labor. So this is a great practice that we recommend. I don't know, Valentín, is this usual practice in other countries? How do you see that?
Well, Erika, and thank you for that great introduction to this topic. Your question is great. Even though for the Brazilian friends who are joining us this morning, this type of requirement and regulation is new. This has been the norm in the US and many other countries for decades now. Because based in the US and other countries, we're seeing the same situation that you described for Brazil. Women are becoming more and more educated. They are the majority of the entering classes at our universities. And yet we don't see the same type of progress when we see compensation comparisons, when we see who is holding the managerial jobs at companies. So, of course, as a labor economist, we ask ourselves, like, what's happening here? Why is it that women who apparently are as prepared or even more educated than men are not advancing? And of course, the governments believe that maybe it's discrimination, and that's why we see these laws enacted. But again, the advantage that we have nowadays is that we have the experience of many years and decades answering and studying these questions in other jurisdictions. For example, like this report that we see in Brazil that, for example, shows that the median, you see here, this 90.5, the ratio of the median salaries of men and women is 90.5, meaning if you take the middle point of the salaries of all women and divide that by the middle point of the salaries of all men, that ratio is 90, meaning that it's 10% lower. And the question like, why is this happening? And then you have the same, if instead of the median, which is just the middle point, you look at the average. And the average is this simple mean or arithmetic mean that you add all the values and divide by the numbers of observations. And the average can be very different from the mean. If you have men with very high salaries or women with very low salaries, the average for that group could vary substantially. And you see here that in Brazil, if instead of the middle point, you use the average, the ratio is even lower, 70, meaning that there's a 30% difference in average salaries to the disadvantage of women. So many people have been asking this question, like, why is this happening? And as you alluded to Dr. Golding's study, for which she won the Nobel Prize last year, the causes behind these numbers are very, very complex. And a lot of that has to do with the society norms. It can be caused by differences in preferences. You know, men and women choose to follow different career paths, and partly because of the expectations of what they're supposed to do at home, outside of work. And for me, it's what's been striking looking at the Brazilian data. You know, if you see these charts here at the bottom that does the same comparisons, but by type of jobs. And you see how, for example, in repair and maintenance, that number is over 100, meaning that women are advantaged. But then you have executive and managers. The numbers are in the 60s, implying differences adverse to women by more than 30%. What's striking when you see this is how similar the numbers are compared to what we see in other countries. So here in the US, we had a similar law passed a couple years ago that, like the Brazilian law, was very controversial. Like companies were certainly required to submit pay reports. And of course, companies pushed against this regulation because that meant that they had to spend time and resources complying, and it wasn't really known what the government was going to do with those results. But the government, in the end, was able to collect the data for 2017 and 2018, and they published some numbers. And just like the Brazilian calculations, in the US, the male median salary was in this 39 to 49,000 range. That was much higher than the median salary in 2018. In 2017, the difference was even bigger. The median male salary was in the 39 to 49, almost 50 range, $50,000 range, while the median female salary was between 25 and 30. So you look at Brazil, you see those differences. You look to the US and you see similar differences. And those differences, we see them everywhere. If we start looking at race, not just gender, which in Brazil you're also you have to look at results by race. You see the same patterns. Here you see the stick figures in orange, those are women. The stick figures in blue, those are the men. And whether you look at people who self-report as white or black or Hispanic, Asians, you see differences. And those differences also vary depending on the group, but men tend to do better. And just like the Brazilian numbers, if you look at these broad occupations, which for those of you in Brazil, if you look at these labels, they will sound familiar to your job classification. You see also differences. The executive and managerial group, you see a very wide difference in compensation, not unlike the one that we're seeing here in Brazil. And it's also interesting how some occupations, they tend to be more, there will be more parity. So service workers and admin workers, they seem to be similar. Just like in Brazil, there are certain occupations where the gaps is small or even is advantaging women. So again, even though for you, those in our audience from Brazil feel like this is like a new world, there is a wealth of information out there about how to think about these numbers. Because as Erika said, if you put these numbers out there because they look like the economy, it may look as if you have a potential issue, when in fact, the question is much more complex. Those differences could vary depending on the job group, and there could also be the good reasons. And the law allows you to explain why the numbers look the way they are. So I think that's why this is a great opportunity to learn best practices to comply with this type of regulation, but also think about how to put reasonable explanation for how the numbers look the way they are. But Eric, I don't know if you have something to add to that.
Yes, if you could please go back to the report, just to give some information here. For example, about the average salary, in this ratio, for the calculation of the average salary, the Ministry of Labor is considering, for example, overtime, commissions that are, of course, conditional to the worker performing overtime work or selling more products or working during the night shift. So although this have a very good explanation according to Golding's theory, that is for as women have more responsibilities at home, they are not available to work overtime, and therefore they work less overtime compared to men. But this is a symptom of our society, and this is not an employer hiring women to work overtime. So this ratio regarding average salary has a really big problem with because it considers salaries that are conditional. So, and if I may add something about the bottom part of this report, when it shows the differences in women's salaries compared to men's, in which you have the bars. The first bar, you will have executives and managers, and it includes information of both a marketing analyst and a director of marketing. So they of course they have really big differences in their activities, in their responsibilities, and therefore in their salaries. So it is not it is a big failure in my view of this information, because how can we accept that a data is showing is considering such different positions, right? So it's really concerning.
Absolutely. Because the idea is that companies are going through the trouble of collecting this data, which I know for experience is very hard to collect, complying, and then putting numbers that don't reflect how the company is really operating. So I think that's why it's very important, since companies have the opportunity to comment on the numbers and explain why they look the way they are, to go ahead and take that opportunity, which means that when companies are complying with this regulation, collecting the data, in Brazil, you have to put these numbers on your website, on your social media, something that in the US is still not a requirement. So you want to also explain why things look the way they are. Because as Erika is saying, the comparisons that you're supposed to make are not really that informative. And that's the thing, like you're collecting all this data, so why not then do the right thing and do the right analysis so you can understand how you look, why you look the way you look. So then if there are corrective actions that need to be taken, you can take them. But if you're operating correctly, because as Erika said, you have very different jobs being compared against each other, then go ahead and say it, because you want to basically put your best image just both for your employees and also for the government, of course.
Yeah, and just to add something about the information that is shown in the bars. So you have different classifications, and this different classifications, they refer to the Brazilian occupation classification system, which provides for a code for each job position. But such positions do not reflect what the positions that exist in each company. So and they also do not reflect different grades. So of course, we will have a disparity in this model of the report, because we are comparing different things, right? So apple and oranges. So
Yep. And for me, as a data analyst, like knowing all those nuances, understanding your data, how you operate, how people get overtime or volunteer for overtime or not, is key, because this will go into that narrative, that explanation that you can attach to your report, explaining, these gaps may look big, but these are the reasonable explanation for those numbers. Because in my experience, most companies, when you do this type of high-level aggregated analysis, they will tend to look as if there are differences, adverse to women or adverse to people of color. But it's because the comparisons are not useful. So they're not useful because they don't reflect your situation, and also are not useful because you cannot use those numbers to improve your situation, because companies, they want to do the right thing. But these high level numbers with these comparisons that are not the best, you cannot use those studies to try to decide whether action is to be taken, because it's a best practice to continuously evaluate your situation and make sure that things look right. So that's why, these type of reports are great in the sense that companies have an incentive to take a closer look at their practices. But that also means that you need to take additional steps and go beyond what the report says, because otherwise it may look as if you have gender pay differences, when in fact, you are doing the right thing, and our other forces is the economy, is societal norms, what's causing this apparent difference. Like, just to give you an idea, in the United States, these economy-wide gender gaps are in the 80s. So we're talking about 80% differences. So that was one of the things that was striking to me looking at Brazilian numbers. Is it seems like I've seen that picture before. And looking at the job classifications in Brazil also sounded very similar to what we have here. So again, even though these regulations are new from a Brazilian standpoint, there's a lot of information out there that companies can rely on to, adopt best practices to face this regulation. So Erika, should we continue talking about what comes next after you put out this
sure.
report?
So just to stress that companies that do not publish the report are subject to a penalty of $20,000. So it is relevant, and it's for each report So this is one of the reasons there are companies filing lawsuits to be released from this obligation. And well, companies that are notified in the context of this law, if the labor auditors come to the conclusion that the salary differences are not justifiable, these companies will have to implement an action plan within 90 days. And the action plan must provide for measures and deadlines to achieve gender pay parity. The labor union and employees representatives must participate in both the development and the implementation of such plans. So it may be a nightmare because I don't know if it's a reality of there in the US, Valentín, but here in Brazil, unions are composed basically by men. In all my career, I only I sat in the table once with a female woman leader, but she didn't speak.
Wow.
All her peers that were male union leaders were the one conducting the negotiation. So how will the unions conduct this matter? It's crazy. We this is our guess here is by having a president that is a former union leader. He had, of course, to create some new paths for unions to have a more relevant role in society. So he implemented this requirement that unions are part of the implementation and development of the plan. But imagine you having to discuss the plan with employees representatives, which is reasonable because these are people that have knowledge about the company's practices, structure, career plan. But you have someone representing the union that doesn't have this knowledge, is often does not have a relationship with the company. So it will be a really a great challenge, and we expect that probably inspections will be starting on October. And the reason we have this expectation is because the instructive norm was published yesterday. And so once the administrative procedures start in the Ministry of Labor, I think this is when we'll have many companies filing lawsuits to not be obliged to implement the action plan, because it will be really hard to demonstrate to a union leader that differences in our salary practices, they are based, for example, in equal pay requirements that are set for by law. For example, different level of productivity, performance of the same activities, and not on discriminatory practices. So yeah, you just jump to the slide which we have the legal requirements for equal pay rights in Brazil. So according to our Employment Act, if the job function is identical, all work of equal value carried out by for the same employer in the same business establishment must be compensated equally, without distinction of gender, ethnicity, nationality, or age. And what is the interpretation about the job function being identical? We refer to having the exactly same activities being performed by different employees. So, for example, if you have a position in which you have junior and senior grades, they probably have different activities. But what companies have to review internally is what if they have a properly described job description, if they have objective criteria for putting someone in junior or senior levels or different grades, whatever. So what another objective criteria is length of service. So two employees will have the right for equal pay whenever their length of service for the same employer does not differ by more than 4 years, and the time in service in the same position do not differ by more than 2 years. So, and from what I learned with Valentín, this is really different than what you have in the US, right?
Yes, Erika. And earlier you said something very important, that I think you said you need to have like pay parity. So what's the definition of pay parity in Brazil? Like, is it to the penny? Like, it has to be identical, or could there be some variance?
According to the Ministry of Labor, it cannot be 1 cent of a difference. So the salaries must be identical.
Wow. And that's I would say it's a stronger requirement than the US federal standards, even though, in the US we have, state laws, and that standard you just mentioned sounds a lot like this standard in California, where they say that the factors that the company puts forth to explain the differential should explain the entire differential. But even though here we don't understand, at least we haven't seen a case where entire, that word has been defined, where they mean, do you really make the two salaries the same to the cent, or can there be some differences that are considered statistically small? But what you see here, like what you were describing, this condition for equal pay in Brazil, in certain respects is kind of similar when they say job function is identical, talk about the same employer, same establishments. So those in the audience who have dealt with US employment law, this would sound similar. But these specific requirements that if you are within 2 years in time in position, within 2 years length of service with the company, you are considered similar. That's beyond what we normally see here. But I think what is very interesting is like the Brazilian law is understanding that there could be good reasons why two people may be paid differently. They may have the same broad job classification like the ones in Brazil, but then you have to also look at this definition of job function is identical. And even though it says same activities, I'm assuming many of you in the audience are thinking like, well, I have these two jobs and they're doing the same activities. And I tell you, like, that's a very, very hard question. And that's why the usual best practice is to think about these questions in advance. Now that you know that you have to do this type of reporting, start thinking about this question. Start looking at your data under this lens, because it is almost surely the case that you will have to put a narrative saying, these are our numbers that we need to publish. They look as if there is a gap, but that gap is explained by differences in job function, differences in length of services, differences in time in same position. So it's this idea like, start early because these requirements are there to stay. Although, Erika, you mentioned that there is litigation, but at least in my experience is that in the end, companies need to comply with this type of study. Now, the other thing that is interesting is that you see this word equal pay. And equal pay sometimes gets confused with what we call pay gaps. And equal pay gaps, and sometimes you're talking about these topics and concepts, and they start to get confused. But I think it's very important to keep in mind that they're very, very different mathematical concepts and even statistical and even labor economics concepts. So that report that you are requiring Brazil to create now with these broad categories is something what I would call a pay gap study. Like it's a very high level, broad comparisons of two groups, men and women, people of color versus white, etc., trying to see are there differences in pay. And those differences in pay could be because of differences in function, differences in tenure, etc. But you start with this big number that may look as if there is a problem, but it's just reflecting good explanation for those differences. Brazilian law, talks about equal pay, or what we in the US call pay equity, where you start making comparisons, apples with apples, oranges with oranges, steaks with steaks. Like we want to say, well, these people are really doing the same language of same activities that we see here in Brazilian law, same activities, talking about same employers, same establishment, thinking about service. So you see that we go from these broad aggregations to something more meaningful, because these pay gaps, it doesn't really they don't tell you, well, first, do you have an issue? And second, if there is an issue, what to do about it? Equal pay comparisons, on the other hand, or pay equity comparisons, when you look at similarly situated employees, and even this term in the US is kind of controversial. Some people say, depending on the state, it's substantially similar or comparable. All these words that I think everybody kind of have an idea of what they are, but it's not that we have precise definitions. But at least it tells you like there are two different things that you need to think about. You have these pay gaps, and then you have equal pay. And why this distinction is important? Well, not only in Brazil, you have these very specific requirements or things that you can consider, but also you want to make sure that you're doing the right thing. And Cynthia, I see that you have a question.
Yes, so I have a question from the audience. I have a couple, but I'll ask the one that I think is on point with what you and Erika just spoke about. In your opinion, does the requirement of same employer in the same establishment limit the application of the principle of equal pay in companies with multiple units or subsidiaries?
Yes, of course. So this was a change that was implemented by the labor reform back in 2017. And it really gave a safer net to companies to differentiate to differentiate salaries, for example. And but thinking out loud here is from a society perspective, maybe this is not a requirement that is we find grounds to justify it, right? So I thinking here, would it be justifiable to have different salaries just because you have a site that is in the south part of the city or in the north part of the city? So it doesn't make so much of a sense, but of course this is a argument we can use in courts. So this is something good for companies. But on the other hand, thinking here with under a human resources perspective, this is not something that I think companies may want to apply, right? It's difficult to justify having different salaries just because someone is sitting in a neighborhood and not in the other, right?
And it's also, it's interesting this, it's saying same employer, because at least it's saying, well, you need to look at people who work together in the same company. It will be odd that a company is being forced to pay like what other company is paying because of company size, whether one is a multinational, one is a startup, they may be paying different salaries. And here, this establishment, it could reflect location differences. Something that I've seen that in almost every country that I've looked at pay equity issues, that there are areas in countries that they pay more, salaries are higher. It's the capital city, or it's a high concentration of companies, and that's why salaries are higher. So the question is it reasonable that people in different states, different cities are paid differently? It seems
Yeah.
that, yeah. You go ahead, Erika.
Sorry, it's just before the labor reform, the law stated that the salaries should be the same whenever the two different employees were in the same municipality or a greater municipality area. So of course, in scenarios in which we have someone sitting here in São Paulo, which is our richer state in Brazil, or in Amazonas, which is in the north part of Brazil and is not very developed and has a lower living cost than São Paulo. This is perfectly okay, right? It makes sense. But whenever we are discussing situations in the same municipality, this sounds awkward, right?
Yep. And remember, we are post-COVID. Imagine all the people who are working remote, and I know that it varies country to country or city to city, but I can see how maybe two people are doing the same thing, and one is working remote, one is in the office, and because of that, do we see differences? So I think the takeaway of this is like, look at all the questions that you need to ask yourself if you're looking at your compensation practices, or when you are filling these reports, and say, do I know how to answer this question? Like, how am I paying people according to municipality? Am I following the law? Am I not? And again, it's a best practice to know the answers to these questions before the government, before a union comes asking. So I think these reports, even though they create an extra burden, extra work for the HR departments, especially for countries that are starting to get into this wave of ensuring equal pay for equal work, it makes them think about these questions, because this is a very interesting question. I can tell you the experience in the US, that even in the same state, like in California, people in the northern part of the state may be paid differently than people in the southern part of the state. And there are different laws and different regulation that say, yes, you can use location differences as an explanation, and some that say that you don't. So again, it's this idea of this requires you to think hard about these questions, because they do matter. And let me put just this example here. If this difference between pay gap and equal pay is not clear, you could have perfect equal pay, and yet your company looks as if they have a pay gap. So this is a fictitious company. We call it ABC Corp. And let's assume that there are only two jobs, job A and job B. So if you see here, these are the salaries of all the people in job A, and these are all the salaries of people in job B. W stands for women, M stands for men. So if you see, this looks like potentially a unionized workplace. If you are in job A, everybody's paid the same, 100,000. If you're in job B, everybody's paid the same, 65,000. So from the point of view of equal pay, there is equal pay in job A. Everybody's paid the same, everybody's paid the same. But then if this company were to go out and put a report like the one required by Brazilian law, it would look as if the mean and median pay of women is much lower than the mean and median pay of men. With regards to the mean or the average, women, if you were to create a Brazilian report with this data, would be lower by 26%. So the ratio would be 74. The median would be 35% difference or a 65% ratio. So like you have perfect equal pay, and then you have a pay gap. And the reason is, as Erika was saying earlier, look at the composition of the jobs. The job that pays the most, only 15% of these jobs, of these people are women. The job that pays the least, 85% of those are women. So you have a pay gap difference, even though you don't have an equal pay issue. Now, the question is, what's happening here? Is the fact that there's only 15% women in the high-paying job something that the company did because of their hiring practices or promotional practices, or this is just reflecting the labor market? So think about for potentially software engineers versus HR personnel. Software engineers, they tend to be more male. HR jobs tend to be more female. So that's why these studies and thinking hard about them can tell you, where to think, where to go to doing analysis and studies to make sure that you address this thing correctly. If you look at these pay gap numbers, it will give you the impression that you need to raise women's salary by 26% or 35%, when the reality is that it's a deeper question, like what's happening here? Why you have so many men in one job and not the other? And again, it could be something the company can do something about it, like outreaching different places to get more women into the higher paying jobs, or it could be that this is the labor market. I cannot, suddenly the company by itself cannot create or find more women for these higher paying jobs. And you can see how, depending which situation you are, you may be able to do something to remediate your pay gap numbers, or say, I cannot do anything because my company reflects the labor market. So Erika, I don't know if you have any thoughts about this example.
No, this is a great example that shows how important it is for companies to have to also publish together with the report the explanatory notes, because it is clear that the difficulties we have in interpreting the data, and it makes really important to companies to have a proper addressing of the inconsistencies of the report, and communicating that the practices the company really has regarding equal pay. So it's a huge recommendation that we make to our clients.
And as you can imagine, if you are filing these reports because you have at least 100 people, and you are thinking like, well, how can I start looking at all, my employees? Imagine you have more than, 500, 600, and you have these requirements of the same number of years, or within 4 years with the company, within 2 years of tenure, and that's where you have statistics and economics that can help you look at these questions consistently. So then you can first of all decide, do you have to make potential adjustment, and second, explain your situation. And so just briefly, we're going to skip some slides here just to basically go to the, another stylized example. Again, just to think about the complexity of your labor force. Imagine a company that is doing technical things, and you have people doing research and developments, people doing, more general administrative work, and you have operations in the US and in Brazil, and you have different type of workers. So Erika, what are your thoughts, for example, on this type of jobs? Like, based on Brazilian law, would they be considered the same or not?
No, not at all, because if they are performing activities connected to the name of their positions, they are totally different activities. So it's reasonable and acceptable that they have different salaries.
But if you think from the pay gap perspective, when you submit your report, that you submit one number, all these squares will go into the same calculation. The CEO, that there's usually only one. There is only one CEO, and even every now and then a company may have two. You have one CEO, as you said, Erika, almost surely a man. And then the highest paid person in the company, and then you have this position. So you need to start using different techniques to take a deeper look at this. And that's where things like statistics can come into play. And since we're short on time, we're going to just go briefly through this. But statistics is basically a way to figure it out. Are things working the way they're supposed to? So here you have job tenure here in the axis in the bottom, the x-axis, and this is salary. And by statistics, you're trying to develop, trying to figure out what's the relationship between salary and tenure. Because according to Brazilian law, differences in tenure can explain or can be used to justify differences in salary. And you can use statistics to say, well, it seems that every year of tenure is worth this much, and then figure out, okay, who seems to be off? And that's where, this type of study, if you do it in advance, it can help you determine whether there are people that we call outliers. So if you are paying, let's say, $10,000 more per every year of tenure, and you look at people who have the same tenure, they should be paid the same. Well, you have a situation here, for example, Isabel, given her salary and her tenure, seems to be making too much. And Laura, on the other hand, seems to be making too little. Same with Hector is making less than we expect. These blue lines measure statistically where you are within a reasonable margin of error, and then you have Marcelo that seems to be making too much. So the idea is that you undertake an analysis like this, that to make sure that if for the report you need to put a narrative with explanation, that you understand what's happening with these people, and maybe decide that maybe Laura needs a pay adjustment, or maybe understand what happened with Marcelo. Maybe Marcelo is in the wrong job, and that's why, there's an error in the data, and that's why his salary looks too high. And again, this is the type of analysis that would allow you to put a narrative that will make your numbers reflect how you operate, and also take corrective actions if needed. Because I think that's something that is very important, and I'm going to go to this section. And again, this is kind of what I wanted to say. If you put the CEO and everybody under the same umbrella, you have a terrible pay gap, just because these people are doing this, are not doing the same job. But again, the idea is undertake this analysis, because based on Brazilian law, you need to develop an action plan if you put a narrative. And Erika, I'll let you explain these requirements.
Yeah, I think as we are short on time, and I mentioned some information about the action plan. Just want to share with our attendees some new information we have on the instructive normative published yesterday. So, so as I mentioned, the Ministry of Labor validated the companies that publish explanatory notes together with the report, and the normative instruction states that the labor auditors, they may request evidence that the report was published. So a good practice is to keep evidence. So of the date the report was uploaded to the company's website and for how long it stayed there. Another thing is that the instructive normative states that although the report serves as basis for inspections, the labor auditors will consider the criteria for equal pay before concluding on the existence of unjustified salary differences. But that they will take into consideration the Brazilian classification code and not the positions that each company has or the different grades they have in their career plans. And also the labor auditors will be responsible for evaluating the action plan in all its stages. So maybe they may interfere when you are negotiating with the labor union on the practices that will be implemented. And the auditors may request adjustments to the plan if they conclude that is inadequate in relation to its purpose. So I think these are the greatest highlights of the normative instruction that was published yesterday.
And what you said, Erika, just underscores the need to proactively look at this type of calculations, because the last thing that you want is to be under a time pressure because of the unions or because of the government investigators asking you questions or forcing you to make actions that may not be the right action. Like the example that we saw before, where there was perfect equal pay within job and a pay gap. You don't want to go in and make pay changes. The right question there was, why don't we have enough women involved in the job that pays more? Which you address differently than if it's purely an issue like, well, this person seems to be paid low. So again, this is a lot of developments in Brazilian law, something that I always tell clients, like, talk to your attorney, because they are the ones who keep up to date with these regulations. For example, see, Erika put out a piece yesterday about this. So again, it's very important to keep in close communication with counsel, because these regulations change constantly. And that's your thing. You need to, and you want to have the best information available to make decisions. But we have maybe a minute or two left on this webinar. And I don't know, Cynthia, if we have any questions from the audience that we may have a minute to answer.
We do. We have two questions that are actually very similar, so I'll combine them into one, which I think is a great question to kind of end the webinar with. But what are the main challenges that companies in Brazil will face in implementing this new wage equity law? And what are some of the best practices and strategies that company can adopt to minimize these risks?
So I believe the biggest challenge will be for companies that are required to implement an action plan. And in this case, we really recommend checking if litigation is not the right path to pursue. because it will be really stressful to have a negotiation together with the union. It will be potentially harmful for the company's reputation. I think it is the most critical point. And as to recommendations, we really believe that all companies should have a very, very deep investigation of all salary differences that are shown in the report, and gather evidence, gather data, because if the company is audited by the Ministry of Labor, you will have 10 days to present a defense. So it is almost impossible to gather all the necessary data within 10 days. So we believe, again, that inspections will start soon, in October or onwards, but companies should really, really investigate any differences and try to mitigate any risks that they find based on equal pay rights.
Start early. Absolutely. These analyses take time. Start early. And again, use the data that you collected in the report to initiate that path. And it's something that gets easier with time. You have to do this report twice a year. So as you go through the process, you will start to recognize designs and best practices that work for you. But those of you who joined, will be circulating a PDF of these slides. And if you have questions, here's our contact information. And we really appreciate your time today with us. And thank you very much. Erika, I'll let you conclude with some final words.
It was a pleasure to be here and to have the experience of having a lot of sharing your experience with us, Valentín. This is awesome.
Thank you. Thank you all.
That's great. Thank you both. And thanks everyone for being here today.